Good evening, colleagues and friends. Thank you very much for these kind words and also for the opportunity to give this lecture. I'm very honored. And my first ISCDR meeting was back in 2005, and I can tell you I haven't missed one edition up until to date. And I hope to attend at least 5 more before I retire. And what I also hope is that younger and future sexual health colleagues will benefit from the science and the networking and the collaborations and the friendship that I have attained in the years past. And I think on that note, we have come to a crossroads. It was already mentioned by Howard Nyo also. Sexual health is under increasing pressure from a liberal backlash. And this is not only happening in the Western countries, but it is on a global scale. And I hope to address this, and that it will not be a story of doom and gloom the next 60 minutes or so, but I hope to inspire you in the end, and also to empower you to help you to continue to contribute to the science, our clients, and also the communities who are most affected by sexual transmitted infections and HIV. But before I will do that, I have some disclosures to make, and they are not from financial nature. I want to show you a little bit about my background. I'm a gay man, I'm married to a man, and I come from a multi-ethnic family. And please meet my family. These are my parents. My father is from Suriname, and this photograph was taken, I think, a few weeks after I was born, so you see me in his lap. And my mother is from the Netherlands, and they married in the 1950s, and I'm very lucky. They're still alive. They are 98 and 94 at the moment, and they're still in pretty well conditions. And you might consider, if you hear my talk, that I am biased by this multi-ethnic background, for example, but I think it offers me a vantage point view that allows some extra insight and in the matters that are at stake currently in our specialty. So this is the outline. I will start with a brief history on sexual health, because I think to know your history helps you to understand the present situation and also to shape your future. And then I will focus in more detail on queer theory, which came along in the 1990s. And I think we can learn a lot about sexuality and also about health in general that can help us in the illiberal backlash that we are facing today. And I will end up on a more positive note. How can we respond to all these things that happen at the moment? So this is the first part. I will start somewhere around the 1850s when there are two opposing views on how to control STIs. These are the reglementarist view and the abolutionist view. And then I will discuss the beginning of the 20th century up until the Second World War. So first of all, the reglementarist view. It started around the heydays of the European colonial empires. And the hygienists, which can be seen as a proto-group of physicians that cared about public health measures, were approached by the military, who were dealing with serious impacts by sexually transmitted infections, which were affecting the war effort. STI were rampant at the continent at that moment. For example, in France, syphilis was the second most common cause of death before the First World War, and this is right after tuberculosis. And this is also the time when male libido and virility were at stake and thought central in society. But since STIs were affecting the male population, the hygienists thought that they could control STI by taking care of what happened with the women, and especially with sex workers. So to protect the male part of society, the solution was sought in controlling, for example, not only prostitution, but also brothels, through mandatory health checks, work bans if necessary, and everything focused on harm reduction. And here you see two campaign posters coming from those days. Very misogynistic campaigns, as you can see. Women are depicted as the carrier of disease and death, and men are depicted as the young, the brave, and the strong. And on the right side, you see a Dutch placard where seafarers are being warned and summoned to turn away from sexual immorality. The opposing view came about around 1880s with the abolitionist movement. And this group of people, and they were mainly found among religious politicians and also the first wave of feminists which came about, they fought against loose sexual morality, which they considered being made possible through the reglementarist view of those days. And they were also focused more on reproductive health and apart from sexual morality. Healthy offspring became central to be achieved through abstinence. And they were successful. Around the turn of the centuries, around the 1900s, sexual hygiene laws were being imposed in many European countries, which were anti-reglementarist with bans on prostitution. And they were also anti-contraception, because it was thought that this could also lead to more immorality. And here you see a group of suffragettes, as they were also called in France. And what is very striking is the second line, which has a fearless, indomitable race. And this stems from another movement that came about around 1883, and that's the eugenics movement. It was coined by Francis Galton, who happens to be a nephew of the famous Charles Darwin. And sadly, he completely misinterpreted the theory of his uncle. Eugenics stems from the pseudoscientific idea that humanity can be broken down into different races and be put along a scale from inferiority to superior. And the idea was to improve the stock through the prevention of procreation of the weak, the feeble, and also the lower classes, but especially to protect the white race from mixing with other races. This was also known as miscegenation, interracial relationships producing mixed race offspring that should be prevented at any cost. And that's what you see also here in this abolitionist campaign against STI. On the left side, you see a very Aryan family who is supposed to be kept free from STI, especially syphilis, of course, because of the congenital transmission. And that should be achieved, but what is standing on this shield, moral containment, family values, youth organizations, prostitution bans. And on the other side, you see a diseased person, probably someone with syphilis, and the candle is just about to go out, as you can see, and that should be kept apart from society by confinement. That's what is said on the sword. And these opposing views, they can be traced back all the way up until the current debate around how sex work should be dealt with. On the left side, you see neo-abolitionist views. It's also called the Nordic model because it started in Sweden in 1999 when the first neo-abolitionist laws were being imposed there, who consider sex work is always equal to oppression. And sex workers should be considered the victims and should be helped out of prostitution. And what should be criminalized under these laws are the clients, but also third parties who enable sex works. This can be landlords, but can also be fellow sex workers who help one another out. On the other side, you see the more reglementarist current policies that are also called the New Zealand sex worker model, who see sex work as one form of work. And through the empowerment of sex workers, by giving them rights and also by destigmatization, it should be regulated and incorporated in society. And again, the proponents of neo-abolitionism are especially found among feminists and also religious politicians. And the problem with this model is that it fails to distinguish the minority of sex workers who are coerced, indeed, from the vast majority who engage in sex work voluntarily. And criminalization of consensual sex acts can isolate sex workers because their allies, as I said, landlords, family members, and also fellow sex workers run the risk of being prosecuted and thus creating an underground market and worsening the problem of forced human trafficking rather than reducing it. And this is the current situation of prostitution laws in the world. Most countries still have prohibitionist laws in red, as a remnant from Victorian age 19th century abolitionist laws, also in dark blue. And the countries that now shift towards the neo-abolitionist laws where the clients and third parties are criminalized are depicted in orange. Sweden started, as I said, around 1999, followed 10 years later by Norway, Iceland, and also Canada here in 2014, Ireland, France, Israel, and the state of Maine in the United States. And the countries who either legalized it or have adopted the New Zealand model are in the minority with parts of Australia and also Belgium. In the US, the abolitionist view had a more blatant racist and xenophobic side. And it's also called the Mann Act, or the White Slave Trade Act, which was imposed in 1910 by the US Constitution. And it's again the eugenic view that racial purity of the white race, and especially white women, was considered under threat through racial mixing. And it was a felony to transport women across state borders for the purpose of prostitution and debauchery. And one of the first victims of this law was Jack Johnson, who you see here depicted with his white spouse, Lucille Cameron. He was the first black American heavyweight world champion, and he had to flee to Montreal first and later on to Paris when he was prosecuted under the Mann Act. Eventually in 1920 he turned himself in and went to jail in the United States because of this. And these white slavery campaigns portray a world filled with sexual danger for young white women, seduced and exploited by sinister dark men. And echoes from this you can still find up until today, this fear of the other, also known as othering, in popular culture. For example, here you see portrayals of the lover boy, as it's called in Europe, and it's also the Romeo pimp scare, where sexual danger for young women comes from dark men, and in the European case, it's often Muslim men. So we move along to World War II, which brought a lot of pragmatism to Europe. Again, you see during wartime that STIs become remnant and a real threat for the war effort. And this was also the case in the British Army, as you can see, but also among the whole UK population, where gonorrhea and syphilis were really affecting the population. And this led in 1916 to a network that's been established in the UK of clinics that offer free, confidential diagnosis and treatment of sexually transmitted infection. And a real landmark is achieved by Mary Stopes in 1921 when she opened the first British birth control clinic. This is a real unique moment. It's the first time that also a nurse-led clinic is run, and female doctors were used for their referrals. And then you see also the professionalization of the genitourinary medicine. It becomes a medical specialty rather than a charity before that age. But Mary Stopes also had another side. Apart from the achievement, Mary Stopes also believed in eugenics. She called for the hopelessly rotten and racially diseased to be sterilized and was vehemently opposed to interracial marriage. Through birth control, she wanted to improve the biological quality of the British population. And as we also know that eugenics will later be used to justify genocidal measures like the forced sterilization of First Nation populations here in Canada, for example, but also the extermination of Herero and Namakwa people under German rule in current-day Namibia. And last but not least, of course, the Holocaust on Jewish and Roma populations during World War II. So World War II, again, you saw a revival of regimentalist laws being imposed in occupied Europe, for example, the reinstallment of the prostitution regulation, and in the Netherlands, until 1952, compulsory treatment was still effective. And again, you see the way that the fight against STI is being depicted. Sex workers are seen as the enemy that needs to be targeted and eliminated with weapons. And this is also an echo to what happened in the COVID pandemic, when President Macron of France also used language like this, like we are at war against the coronavirus. With the introduction of penicillin, we see a dramatic decline during the 1950s of STIs like syphilis and gonorrhea. And this is also when the silent generation becomes into adulthood. So I will move to the second part of this short history on sexual health with the 1960s, which brings to the baby boom generation enters adulthood. This is really the era of sexual revolution, the second wave of feminism, the advent of oral contraceptive, civil rights movement, and the decolonization of the European empires. And here on the right, you see Marsha Johnson, who was a transgender woman of color, who was key in the uprising at the Stonewall Inn in New York City's West Village against the police brutality, which was an everyday occurrence. And this is also considered the unofficial launch of the modern LGBTQI movement. These were very elitist and small movement in the 1960s, but the 1970s were characterized by a more broad destigmatization of sexually transmitted infections. And I hope that this campaign that was broadcasted on American TV will run. If I click this button, yes. Is for everybody, not just for the few. Anyone can share VD with someone nice as you. VD is for everybody, darling, have no doubt that anyone can get VD. That's what it's all about.
If you're curious or confused, get information or a pamphlet at most pharmacies or a health clinic. If you need help, see a doctor.
Yes. As you can see in this wonderful VD campaign, anyone can VD. And well, this is the times that should be remembered currently. So as was already explained by Mark, in 1975, WHO comes with a very important declaration on sexual health. It is a holistic approach. It strives for a positive integration of all human aspects of sexuality. It focuses on human rights, and from that, it influenced a lot of subsequent definitions, which we will later on meet also in queer theory. And it's also the foundation for very important public health programs that we still benefit from today. And King Holmes, you already met, who passed away sadly this year. He was from a new generation of sexual health and STI researchers. And together with Ernst Stoltz, they founded the International Society of STD Research in 1977. So in 2 years' time in India, we can celebrate the 50th anniversary of this group of researchers. They were a younger generation, the baby boom generation, who split off from the International Union of STI because they were sick of the stuffy leaderships from the silent generation. They strive for a more multidisciplinary approach, also incorporating social sciences, for example, and for the destigmatization of sexually transmitted infections. And it was also an exciting time coming from the laboratory, for example, the discovery of new STI organisms like chlamydia. And then in the 1980s, we hit a wall with yet another new pathogen, this time HIV, and it is deadly this time. And this was unseen since syphilis was turned into a treatable disease with the introduction of penicillin after the Second World War. And this also triggered old reflexes. Again, you see criminalization and also stigmatization of those who live with the disease. And you see it is in this incredibly stigmatizing campaign coming from the Netherlands again, where you see a patient with AIDS and his body is covered in Kaposi sarcoma, and it says, "Can I seduce you to have safe sex?" The AIDS epidemic also ignites a lot of activism, which is very much influenced also by queer theory. It's against homophobia, because AIDS around that time is portrayed as a gay disease, not only by media, but also by healthcare and science in the beginning. And new slogans emerge like "nothing about us without us," and also "silence equals death." And queer theory became really central in this movement. It is not your identity so much that decides whether you will get the virus, being a gay man, but it's what you do, having safer sex in that context. And identity should not be based on some fixed idea, but should be based on affiliation. Those who are affected by AIDS are not only gay men, but also other men who have sex with men, sex workers, and their allies, like healthcare workers, scientists, and also friends and family. And this brought about the concept, those living with HIV. And nothing about us was put into practice with the establishment of what is now called community or co-led clinics. By giving agency and also involving key populations in the design of how clinics are run and also what care is being offered, this leads to far more efficient and also effective care because it's tailor-made. And those key population members should not only be involved as volunteers, but they should also be on the payroll to really have a full say in what's going on in the clinic. And a good example is the first community-led transgender clinic, which was established in Bangkok, called the Tangerine Clinic. And about 10 years ago, we adopted this model also at the Amsterdam Public Health Service, where we collaborate now with Trans United Europe. So I mentioned queer theory already several times. This was coined by Teresa de Laurentiis at a conference in 1990 at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And Teresa de Laurentiis was an Italian author and a scholar who was not only interested in women and lesbian studies, but also very much in pop culture as it appears in film and also in literature. And queer theory builds upon the work of the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Foucault argued that sexuality isn't a natural pre-existing entity, but rather it's a product of social and historical forces. And he analyzed how current day's ways of talking and thinking about sexuality, he called it discours, were formed in the 18th and 19th centuries. Identities like homosexuality and heterosexuality that shape our understanding today. And he believed that these societal and cultural and medical identities mold us into roles that we take along. And Foucault was really interested in societal power dynamics. He distinguished the period before the Industrial Revolution, where there was a simple linear power dynamic between the states, in many cases sovereigns, for example, and their subject. And that completely changed after the post-industrial era, where a more network, diffuse relationship between state and citizens were unveiled by him. And he used the analogy of the panopticon prison architecture, where you see the prisoners are being placed in the periphery, in the circle, around a central watchtower, where the guards will monitor the prisoners. And the problem is that the prisoners often do not know whether the watchtower is being filled with guards. So they start to self-monitor and also self-discipline themselves because they do not know whether they are under surveillance at that moment or not. And that's exactly what Foucault also identified what happens in society. And the watchtower then is being populated by power structures like the government, but also religion, for example, and medicine, doctors, and nowadays social media. And he also called it the biopower or body politics. And this societal network is built upon fixed identity about race, about gender, and also about sexuality. And the end goal is to create docile bodies which are necessary for consumer capitalism and high levels of production and consumption. Thank you. I need that, not to become dry in 60 minutes. And there's a famous apocryphal story about Michel Foucault, who was sitting in a Parisian cafe, and he was approached by the waiter, and the waiter introduces himself and says, "I am your waiter." And Foucault replies, "No, no, no, you are not a waiter, you do a waiter. It's not your identity, but you play a role at that moment." And that's always exactly what here is depicted in these three women who have identities that are confined who they are: the career woman, the trad wife, and the one who tries to be thin and meet the ideal figure that is being proposed in media, that a woman should have a thin body. And identity is also used by populist politicians nowadays to control society through the scapegoating of migrants or refugees or transgender persons, for example. And by igniting fear and resentment, they create an electorate of docile bodies. And Foucault called these discourses also identity stories. But what he also acknowledged is that these identity stories can also lead to reverse discourses. For example, the invention of the homosexual male in the 19th century made strong negative control possible, but it also opened the possibility of the gay rights movement in the 20th century. A more modern example of counter-narratives are the Black Lives Matter movement against the policing of black bodies, and the Red Umbrella movement of sex workers who are fed up with being saved by neo-abolitionist politicians. So Foucault also had critique on the medical establishment, us here in the room, because he also considered that we are part of a power structure by shaping medical knowledge and also practice. And he argued that medicine, rather than being a neutral science, is a product of specific historical and social context. And I already showed you the reglementarist and abolutionist view and homosexuality, but also, for example, the negative views around masturbation stem from the 19th century. And we shouldn't forget that also today we have these forms of laws and regulations that we impose on our clients. Think of, you should be screened for STI, you should use condoms, you should be vaccinated, and not only against hepatitis B, but also for Mpox, for example. It's like in this comic of New York Times, you have to tick a lot of boxes before we can approve you to have sex. And we should be aware that this also creates counter-narratives. And we met this during the COVID period, for example, with all the negativity around being vaccination. How to answer this is again in community engagement. We shouldn't do anything about the key populations that we want to serve without their involvement. Judith Butler is another foundational thinker in queer theory. And she looked at the aspect of gender, and especially on women. Around that time, the second wave of feminism was very much a white and middle-class phenomenon. And that's what you also see here. In often cases, these group of feminists excluded the experiences and the realities of, for example, women of color and also of sex workers. And with that, Judith Butler also built upon earlier black feminists. And she's posed that we should avoid general assumptions on gender, gender roles, as if they are coherent phenomenon. Kimberly Crenshaw was, for example, a very important black feminist who was looking especially at why black women are more marginalized than white women. And she came up with the idea about intersectionality. She is a critical race theory who still lectures at the University of California in Los Angeles. And she saw intersectionality as social categorizations like race, class, gender, and also sexual orientation. They create overlapping systems that can, on the one hand, lead to discrimination and disadvantage, which you see here below the purple line, or they can create a privileged class, for example, white heterosexual males. And it's exactly that point that's being opposed now by right-wing politicians, and especially the affirmative actions and also the diversity and equity and inclusion laws that are being abolished in the United States. So the idea is that at this moment, white men are being discriminated. But you only have to look at the statistics to prove this wrong. So intersectionality we also see incorporated in what is called syndemic theory. And a good example of a syndemic theory is the metabolic syndrome, which explains why certain populations are at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. You see multiple underlying health issues in these populations, like obesity, smoking, hypertension, diabetes, and also lack of physical exercise. And you also see syndemics more likely to emerge under health inequalities, for example, poverty, stigmatization, stress, or social structural violence. And Ronstahl applied this to explain why especially men who have sex with men are particularly vulnerable to contract STIs and HIV. And what he identified was a clustering of and vulnerability to mental health problems, multiple drug use, intimate partner violence, child sexual abuse, depression, and condomless sex, which all contribute to the increased chances for HIV and STI in this group. Back to Butler. Butler is also famous for the idea that 19th century binary ideas logically emanate from one another. It's called also the heterosexual matrix. You have a fixed sex, you're either male or female, and upon that society builds a gender, and that also determines your sexual preference, whether it's for the opposite sex or for the same sex. And instead of fixed gender assumptions based on historical binary concepts coming from religion and society, she proposes that your body doesn't determine your gender and your gender doesn't determine your desires. So we should get rid of the arrows that you see depicted here. And you have a body, you may perform an identity, and you may have desires. And that's probably where queer theory is most famous of, that it strives to break through the binary. Gender explained using continuums in the political and policy discourse. And I think that's often most misunderstood about queer theory, it's that it's not trying to raise walls between identity, but it's trying to break these walls down between the identity. Sex, gender, orientation are all human dimensions which are not fixed continuums, or you can also see them as spectra, as you can see here in this graph. Another thing to realize is that Western 19th century binary concepts do not always apply on a global scale. In other societies, it's often not so much who you are, but rather what you do. And that's very contrary to the Western idea of testifying. If you are gay, you should get out of the closet. There are far other views on gender. For example, in Yucatan, Mexico, there is an indigenous population called the Zapotecs, and they acknowledge the existence of muxe, which could be considered from a Western perspective transgender men, and they are very much accepted in Sopotec society and appreciated. So gender presentation as female or male is far less important in that society than living as a Zapoteco individual. And you can see the same thing also in Buddhism and in many Southeast Asian countries where general views about gender and sexuality are far more fluid and ultimately impermanent rather than fixed and inherently existing. Another important queer theorist was Gail Rubin, and what we can learn from her is the concept of sex positivity. In Gail Rubin's view, sexuality is a highly personal and private subject that is formed by culture, religion, law, media, and medicine, again echoing from Foucault's idea. And what is acceptable or unacceptable is for many a personal viewpoint which mistakenly is imposed on society at large. And that's what you see depicted here. We all form a good charmed circle of what we consider to be good sex, whether it's heterosexual, within a relationship, monogamous, focused on procreation, and everything which falls outside of it, SM, masturbation, using sex toys, having sex for money, for example, is considered the bad outer limits. And where the problem arises is that the line should not be crossed, because that is the line between what is often considered order on the one hand and chaos at the other center. For that reason, it should be constantly confirmed and also defended. And it actually ignites fear in many people when the line is being crossed. And what Gail says is that what matters in the end is that sex should be consensual from all involved without coercion, and it's the quality of pleasure that's important. And here again, you see where the WHO declaration steps in, coming from 1975. And it also brings into mind the wartime approach that I already showed you on STI. When we talk about helping out, we often speak of risk groups that are targeted and stigmatized, instead of seeing the communities most affected as agents, and instead of finding out what the motivations and the needs are to come up with a tailor-made and efficient form of interventions. NIED has for a long time already composed HIV language guides, and the latest edition was published last year. Luckily, just before the current administration took effect. You could wonder if this would still be allowed under the current administration in the United States. And it proposes very much to destigmatize the language used. When you have a clinical trial, don't talk of subjects, but talk of participants or volunteers, to acknowledge their agency in the trial. And also, please don't speak about hard-to-reach population. It's us who are hard to reach from a community perspective. So it's better to talk about underserved population. And this language is often perceived as language policing. But it's precise language which is important to become aware of unconscious biased assumptions. For example, phrases like unprotected or unsafe sex, they are not only sex negative and very stigmatizing, but they're also inaccurate in the sense that we have so many different interventions apart from condoms, PrEP, post-exposure prophylaxis, we have vaccinations. So if you talk about unprotected sex, you have no idea what exactly you mean that someone should do to protect oneself from STIs of HIV. All the pictures that I showed you come from this wonderful book called Queer, A Graphic History. I can really recommend it. You read it in 2 hours' time and you will be laudated with a lot of other queer theories that I haven't mentioned in this presentation. Joanne already mentioned it. We had a workshop this morning about the Atlas of Queer Anatomy. It's a bio-art project together with the artists Kwang Yi Koo and Chu Yan Chen, who is a designer. And what we try to do in this project, where we composed a critique on the famous Atlas of Human Anatomy of Netter, which was first appeared in the 1950s. And if you look at it from a current day perspective, it's quite heteronormative and also has a very wide perspective on what is being taught in the medical curriculum. And what we try to do with the Atlas of Queer Anatomy is to unveil health issues that are of importance for sexual minorities. And for example, the picture that you see here, you see chlamydia bacteria that are transmitted internally via the gastrointestinal tract. And this offers a possible hypothesis that can explain why lymphogranuloma venereum in men who have sex with men, for the largest part, is diagnosed in the rectum and rarely in the urogenital tract. If you want to know more, please buy the Atlas. Because you can support us by buying it. And I can assure you that all revenues that we make will be used to sponsor other artists and scientists who want to contribute with additional chapter and make it a real living art project. Currently we have 5 chapters. The picture I showed you comes from the first chapter on STI and the blurry boundaries between health and disease. We have a chapter on intersex bodies, and new are body odor and the importance in sexual selection, masturbation as primordial sexuality, and we also cover sex toys and gender-affirming surgery. But first, before you buy the Atlas, you might want to have a look at our website. It's a very dynamic display, and it gives you a good overview of what you can expect. So we have to move on to the backlash that we face currently in sexual health. This is a longer existing backlash, which was focused also on LGBTQI persons on a global scale. And you here see the map of ILGA, which shows the laws that are being imposed against minority sexual orientations in the world. And the more red it is, the more criminalized, and in some cases, death penalty is still being imposed in some country on same-sex sexual acts. It cannot be explained only by the governments that are at stake, liberal governments, populist governments, and also theocratic governments in some cases, but also you see the remnants of the British colonies with Victorian morality acts still in place, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where there also is a lot of criminalization still of same-sex sexual acts. And in the last 10 years or so, we now see also an increase in far-right populist parties winning elections in Europe. And in some places they also form governments. An example is my country, the Netherlands, where the Freedom Party is the biggest party with a very far-right political agenda. If they do not form governments, they can still have influence. And this is the case in Germany, where the AfD party is not in the government, but they really dictate the agenda on migration, for example. And the picture that's being framed by these far-right parties is that the white male heterosexual hierarchy in society is being threatened by non-white Muslims and also what is called the enemy within. And these are academics, journalists, and also artists. And that's a justification for anti-decadence, as it's called, and anti-gender ideology, and also anti-immigrant laws that are tried to be imposed. You also see that church-related organizations align with far-right politicians, promoting traditional family values. And what they use often, for example, is that they equal homosexuality to pedophilia. And the Vatican in Rome, for example, had a very anti-transgender agenda up until to date. It has effects directly in the Netherlands. We will have to close our public health laboratory next year because of the serious budget cuts that we face, and this will also impact our scientific research, unfortunately. Remember this picture that I showed you? It comes from the abolitionist campaign around the turn of the century. These eugenic tendencies are presented again and used by far-right politicians and white supremacists as dog whistles. As you can see in this ex-post coming from Geert Wilders, who is the leader of the Freedom Party, and it says in Dutch, the sun will shine again in the Netherlands. And it made him the biggest party in the country. And the message is, keep white majorities free from non-white influences. Going south of the border of Canada, the US developments, we see at the first day in office of the new government, CDC is seriously being confronted with budget cuts and also with layoffs. They have an ideologically anti-science Minister of Health appointed. This CDC laboratory, which was really world-leading and transforming in many aspects, has been closed. I heard that by a law or by a judge, this is now halted and it's being reinstalled for the moment. And of course the US aid program, which has abruptly been halted, which has incredible damage. I show you also later on. And Jeannie Marazzo, many of you will know her. She was one of the presidents of the ISSDR in the past. She was appointed under the Biden administration as NIAID director, and she was sent on administrative leave last April, and she was offered a position at the Indian Health Service, Alaska. She will give the closing keynote symposium on Wednesday, so please support her and go there. And on the picture you see the money-loving tech bros who pledge allegiance to the inhabitants of the White House. And please keep in mind that this is the same group of large technology and social media company leaders who previously backed Barack Obama in the 1990s. This is a recent study where it's modeled the impact of the PEPFAR funding freeze on HIV deaths and infections. It's a mathematical model based on the numbers of 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And they have various scenarios. They also have a scenario where it's been possible that there will be a continuation of the aid after 4 and 8 weeks. Well, that didn't come true. So we probably are confronted with the realistic scenario, which assumes a near total system collapse due to the program dependency. And for the next 7 years, this will lead to thousands of additional new HIV infection and also HIV deaths. And there's a much wider agenda going on. There's also an anti-women's rights movement coming on. Access to contraception and abortion are being blocked. And the anti-LGBTIQ agenda is also reflected in the Texas online age verification law that is supposed to keep underage from online pornography. It also censors those looking for information on STI and LGBTQI issues. Health research projects, especially involving transgender health, are being halted. And the latest action of the Department of Justice demands doctors and hospitals for private patient details on gender-related care for minors in an attempt to stop them from care provision. And last but not least, it's a very racist agenda. The demolition of the diversity, equity, and inclusion policies in government, but also the pressure to demolish these laws in large companies and also in universities by withdrawing or threatening to withdraw funds and contracts. These are the words that are being banned to purge wokeism, as it is called, from the federal government. And you can see many of those words we use on a daily basis in our talks, in our articles also, when we talk about sexual health. And we were confronted with this when I was a co-author and we wanted to report on a randomized controlled trial for a new gonorrhea drug. We also have transgender participants in this trial, and there was a co-author from a US government organization who said that he would be in serious trouble if this would appear in table 1 of the manuscript. So we decided to bury gender data in a supplemental. So where do we stand at the moment? It could very well be that we are on a swinging pendulum between liberalism on the one side and illiberalism on the other side. And since the WHO Sexual Health Declaration 50 years back, it is the question whether we have already made 2 steps forward and now we make 1 step backwards, or is it the other way around? We've made only 1 step forward and now we are confronted with 2 steps backward. In any case, the current illiberal counter-revolution should be taken seriously. But maybe we can put some hope from a Canadian thinker, Alexandre Lefebvre, who says that he sees that the anthropological transformation, as he calls it, that we have seen in the 1960s, made the current society a liberal society as the water that fish swim in. And that's what you see here in this comic. There are 2 younger fish are swimming by an older one, and the older fish politely asks, "How is the water today?" And the younger fish looks at his spouse and says, "What the hell is water?" And Lefebvre would say that water is the liberalism, but time will tell if this will save us. Judith Herman is a psychiatrist at the Harvard University, and she's done a lot of work and studies on sex offenders. And she also treats sex offenders who want to be treated. And what she says that rapists are seldomly your typical dark, sinister stranger. In reality, most rapes are committed by people the victims know. And the population of rapists doesn't look that much different from the general population. They do not qualify for any psychiatric diagnosis in far of the most cases. They look normal, and many of them also have positions of power and prestige. And particularly those who are serial offenders often use their status to access victims. They use coercion and threat, they use intimidation, they use emotional abuse, they isolate their victim, and when they are confronted, they minimize, they deny, and they blame. And what Judith Herman says is that the similar tactics are being used as strategies by tyrants and also in fascist regime. The strong do what they please because they can. They coerce, they threaten, they economically abuse, they isolate marginalized populations and scapegoat, and when threatened, they minimize, deny, and blame opponents. Does it sound familiar? The weak submit because they have no other choice. It is the bystanders who are either complicit or too terrified to interfere or who just don't care. And that's exactly where she sees the solution. We should shift the blame to the perpetrator, the tyrant. Bystanders determine whether tyranny succeeds or fails. And when we look away, when we blame victims or become complicit, the victim remains isolated and the rules of tyranny perfectly work. But when bystanders rally behind the victim or the vulnerable and say, "We will not tolerate this," the blame shifts to the perpetrators where they belong. And in an interview in the New York Times, she also recalls that when she was 11 years old, her parents, her mother was a famous psychoanalyst and her father was a scholar, they were called to testify before Senator McCarthy in the House Un-American Activities Committee. And she refused to answer the question and also refused to name names. And they lived through the times like this. And her advice was, activism is the antidote against despair. So let's try to hold on to that. And the International Science Council also advises science activism, and that can be illustrated by an iceberg. Not all people and scientists have to engage in non-violent acts and civil disobedience. Also, in the blue zone, it's very important to support behind the scene So not all science have to be arrested or put their job at stake. But history tells us that it's a necessary part of an impactful societal, social movement. And we should also become better communicators to counter misinformation, because anti-science and anti-intellectual distrust is one of the tactics that are being used currently by far-right movements. And we need to respond by sharing our views. The question only is, how do we do it effectively? And as scientists, we try to bring data and arguments to the table to convince the public. And that's also often called the deficit model of science communication, which assumes that the public is an empty vessel that needs to be filled with scientific knowledge. And it suggests that if scientists communicate their findings effectively, the public will automatically understand and accept them. It often is a one-way flow of information from expert to public, and what we lack to consider is that the public has existing knowledge and also values or beliefs. And there's a very famous paper coming from climate change researchers who already for a very long time are dealing with polarizing impacts of science literacy and numeracy. For example, the perceived climate change risk. And in this article, two hypotheses were being tested on perceived climate change risk. The science comprehension thesis, it's like the deficit model, it states that individuals fail to take climate change seriously because they do not understand the scientific evidence. In a sense, there is a conflict between scientists on the one side and the general public on the other side. Another thesis, called the cultural cognition thesis, states that individuals form perceptions of societal risk based on the values of peer groups. And this is a conflict between different segments within the public. And what they found is that the group that believes in personal freedom and self-reliance and prefers a social system with clear ranks and established authorities, they call it the hierarchical individualist, but you could also say your regular MAGA voter. More information not only doesn't work in case of skepticism, but it can even increase polarization. So when we communicate as science, we mostly do it to a specialized audience, what we will do in the coming 3 days. We look for information and we give detailed information in jargon. But this is different when you speak to general audiences who look in most cases for entertainment. They want to have the big picture and they want to have it in accessible language. And last but not least, take into account that they have values, emotions, and beliefs already that you have to take into consideration. So how do you engage your audience? Clickbait. Humans are very curious by nature. And luckily, we do not have to rely on cat pictures. We are lucky, since sex is the most powerful clickbait subject there is. But you should know your audience. What are their interests? What matters to them? And don't feel bashful to use also pop culture to get a sense. And we have to cross the curiosity gap. What do they know and what do you want them to know? And you have to be persuasive and be informative. Choose your medium. If you like podcasts, listen to podcasts and try to find out what makes a good podcast different from a bad or ineffective podcast. But you can have comics, you can make clips, for example, but create a story. For example, every day everything was the same, and then my research results came. And now on, everything is different. Do you need to be an artist? No. If you look at a very famous scientific communicator, xkcd.com, you see you can use stick figures. It's about making it small because less is more. And also use social media. You can see that across the generation, it is really replacing traditional broadcasting media. So make benefit of that. And also align with journalists. Be findable on websites and via social media for journalists that can help you out. I will show you a short clip. For the sake of time, I will not play it completely, but please take knowledge how it is formed. Use need-to-know basis, less is more. Use metaphors and comparisons. Use different points of view. Use comparisons to show differences.
Vaccines save more than 9 million lives each year, even though they contain ingredients that can be pretty dangerous. But that's precisely the point. Those nasty ingredients are the only reason that vaccines work at all. On their own, our bodies are already pretty good at fighting off illness. When an unfamiliar pathogen invades our body, patrolling immune cells engulf a few of these foes to gather intel. The cells then churn out a chemical alarm, transmitting the enemy's information along the chains of command and triggering the production of specially targeted antibodies and assassin cells to fend off the rest of the invaders. After the battle, some of these specialized troops stick around so that if the pathogen returns, they can help mount a quicker response. However, some pathogens are so powerful that they can overwhelm the immune system before it's able to mount a defense. Vaccination lets us stage a practice version of this battle in advance of the real one, so that the immune system can develop and stockpile weapons specifically targeted at the enemy. That does require introducing a bit of the enemy into our bodies, but it's an enemy that we've already disarmed, either by killing it, breeding a super weak strain, or dismembering it to get at recognizable, but not dangerous, parts. Enter formaldehyde. It's a critical ingredient in some common vaccines, like those for tetanus and influenza, because it alters the structure of those pathogens just enough to render them harmless. This reactivity also makes formaldehyde dangerous to us in large doses, but vaccines contain only a tiny fraction of the formaldehyde we consume in food and naturally produce in our bodies on a daily basis. In fact, the biggest risk with formaldehyde is that it can leave pathogens so crippled that they won't trigger the proper immune response. So some vaccines contain substances called adjuvants, which put the immune system on higher alert. Aluminum, for example, causes a minor irritation at the injection site, summoning immune cells to the scene so they'll encounter the weakened enemy. And although too much aluminum can be toxic, our bodies are super efficient at eliminating it, keeping levels low even after lots of shots. So while boatloads of aluminum, buckets of formaldehyde, and an up-close meet and greet with a full-strength pathogen are all definitely bad ideas, a controlled concoction from a doctor is designed to be just nasty enough to keep us safe. There's always a chance of an adverse reaction to a vaccine's ingredients, but the much scarier scenario would be to let polio, measles, and other deadly diseases call the shots.
Yes. So that almost brings me to the end of this hour. What I hope you take home and take to heart is what happens today stems from the past. Current debates on sex work roots in ideas that were born in the 19th century. And the same applies to the binary view on sex, gender, and identity. And queer theory can offer new perspectives. Medicine and science are not neutral institutions. And that should evoke us to engage in community engagement. And intersectional views can give insight on what key populations, what's at stake for key populations in syndemic theory. We are faced by an illiberal counter-movement against sexual health. It's a global phenomenon, and the end is not yet in sight, but hopefully liberalism is the water we swim in. But until then, we have to respond. Activism comes in many forms. You don't have to rush out into the streets or climb the barricades. But bystander action can shift the blame from victims to perpetrators. And we need smarter science and health communication. So take into account the values, the emotions, and the beliefs of the general audience. I want to conclude with a poem of Audre Lorde, who was a black American feminist, a scientist, and also a poet, who is inspiring and up until to date for many queer theorists and activists. She wrote this poem when she was recently diagnosed with breast cancer in 1987, and it's called A Litany for Survival. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk. For by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. And when our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very inspiring and thoughtful conference, and above all, fearless conference. Thank you.